You never really appreciate a fence until someone decides to move it 6 feet without asking. I woke up that Saturday morning, stepped outside with my coffee, and almost spilled it when I saw what had happened. The fence I had painstakingly built, weathered, straight, aligned perfectly with the property line, was now misaligned. 6 feet of yard had vanished, shoved into the neighbor's space, and the people responsible were standing across the way, chatting like it was the most normal thing in the world. My first thought was, you've got to be kidding me. My second thought, almost immediately, was, okay, we're going to fix this creatively. I paced the yard, staring at the newly shifted boards. My backyard, which had felt secure and private for years, suddenly felt exposed. The swing set was oddly positioned, the sunlight hitting the garden differently, and my sense of order gone. I could feel that simmering anger building, the type that makes you clench your jaw and mutter under your breath. But instead of storming over, yelling, or making threats, I decided to channel that frustration into something productive, something unforgettable, something that would teach a lesson without escalating into petty drama. And then it hit me. If they could move my fence 6 feet, I could move their entrance. Literally. The driveway, the walkway, the gate, they relied on it every day. I didn't want to destroy anything. I didn't want to risk legal trouble. But I could make a subtle, strategic change that would force them to acknowledge boundaries in a way they couldn't ignore. And the thought of that, well, it made the anger fade into anticipation. First, I needed a plan. I measured my property line meticulously, checking the old survey and mapping out where the fence had originally stood. Then I measured their entrance, noting exactly where the driveway, gate, and pathway began. I visualized how I could shift the layout in a way that was safe, legal, and dramatic. Every detail mattered: the slope of the path, the placement of posts, the alignment with the street. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precision, clarity, and a lesson they wouldn't forget. My kids noticed my pacing and curiosity. "Dad, what are you plotting now?" my youngest asked, peeking around the porch. I smiled, keeping my voice calm. "Just making sure the yard is fair again," I said. And I meant it. This wasn't about me being petty. It was about boundaries, property rights, and strategy. And maybe, just a little bit, about the satisfaction of turning someone else's arrogance into a learning moment. Over the next few days, I began gathering materials. Stakes, markers, measuring tape, some gravel, and tools for adjusting the pathway and gate alignment. I mapped out the changes, double-checked every measurement, and imagined the moment when they would see their entrance shifted, subtle but undeniable. It had to be precise. If it looked accidental, the lesson would be lost. If it was over the top, it might look malicious. The balance was crucial. As I started work, I noticed them glancing curiously from across the street. Karen, the apparent ringleader, had her hands on her hips, looking confused. I waved politely, pretending to be doing routine yard maintenance, while inside, I felt that quiet thrill that comes from anticipation. Every step of the layout, every stake placed, every line measured was part of a plan to restore fairness and respect. I also documented everything meticulously. Photos of the old fence, measurements of the original property line, notes about the new layout. Not paranoia, strategy. If they tried to argue, if there was a dispute, I would have clear evidence. And honestly, it was fun. Not destructive fun, but the kind of satisfying, clever planning that makes a small victory feel huge. By midweek, the groundwork was set. Stakes marked the new pathway, lines drawn to show the new driveway angle, and the old fence finally repaired to its proper location. The real test would come when they tried to use their entrance again. And I imagined it like a scene in a movie. Karen stepping out, expecting normalcy, and then realizing the path was subtly shifted, just enough to make her stop, think, and finally acknowledge the boundary she had ignored. I double-checked everything, pacing back and forth, taking in the sight of the yard, the fence, the pathway, and the newly aligned entrance markers. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't angry anymore. The anticipation of the moment when they would realize the consequences of their actions was more satisfying than any immediate confrontation could be. And as I finished setting the final marker, I felt that calm, controlled excitement, the kind that comes from knowing you've planned something clever, fair, and irreversible. Finally, I stepped back and took a deep breath, coffee in hand, surveying the yard from end to end. The fence was back in place, The property lines clearly marked, and the subtle shift of their entrance perfectly executed. Everything was ready. All that remained was for them to discover it, and for the lesson to land, without me saying a single angry word. And as I watched the sunlight hit the newly repaired fence and the adjusted entrance lines, I realized something important. The best victories aren't about shouting or retaliation or making someone feel small. They're about patience, planning, strategy, and the quiet, undeniable assertion of boundaries. And in that moment, with the yard perfectly restored and the stage set, I knew the payoff would be worth every careful measurement, every calculated step, and every moment of anticipation. The next few days were all about execution. I wasn't just fixing a fence. I was shifting an entire narrative, subtly but undeniably. I started by preparing the path markers and recalibrating the entrance. Stakes were driven into the ground, measuring tape stretched taut between them, and I marked the new alignment for the driveway and gate. Each line, each stake, each marker was carefully calculated to be functional, safe, and legally correct, but just enough to make Karen notice the difference immediately. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as she pulled into the street, humming like nothing had changed. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. She had no idea the lines had shifted. The driveway she trusted, the gate she assumed she could rely on. It was subtly different, adjusted by inches here, a foot there, in a way that would confuse anyone expecting the old layout. I leaned back, letting the anticipation build. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about patience, cleverness, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a plan unfold perfectly. Each adjustment required precision. The gate posts had to be moved carefully, ensuring the swing and lock worked properly. Gravel and sand were shifted to maintain the slope for drainage. I double-checked every line, ensuring the new path wouldn't damage her vehicle, but would be subtly inconvenient enough to communicate the lesson. Every step was deliberate, and I documented it meticulously. Photos, sketches, notes, timestamps. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. I wanted proof that the work was precise, legal, and functional, and that Karen couldn't argue the validity of the boundaries later. Karen and her friends were oblivious as I worked. They walked past, chatting, sipping coffee, thinking I was doing routine yard maintenance. I smiled and waved politely, pretending to prune a bush, while inside, I imagined their faces when they tried to use the entrance for the first time. That anticipation, the quiet thrill of knowing the lesson would land without confrontation, was almost cinematic. I could picture it like a slow-motion reveal, her pulling up, expecting normalcy, and suddenly realizing everything had shifted. By midweek, the groundwork was complete. The markers were set, posts adjusted, and the path leveled. I even placed small reference stones to guide traffic subtly, so it would function correctly, but also highlight the shift. My kids noticed the subtle changes and giggled, sensing the tension in the air. "Dad, she's going to be so confused," my youngest whispered. I chuckled quietly, nodding. It was true. This wasn't destructive. This wasn't harmful. It was education through clever, safe, and undeniable adjustment. The first test came when Karen finally drove down the street. She slowed as she approached the entrance, eyes narrowing, fingers on the steering wheel, ready to pull in. And then she paused. Something was off. The gate didn't align as expected. The driveway felt slightly uneven. The entry angle subtly shifted. She frowned, tapped the wheel, leaned out, and muttered something under her breath. And there it was, the moment I had envisioned for days. She noticed the boundary had moved. Not violently, not maliciously, just undeniably. I watched her pause, circling slowly, checking the space, adjusting the mirror, trying to figure out what had changed. I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, pretending to adjust a flower pot, and resisted the urge to smirk too broadly. The subtlety was perfect. She couldn't claim sabotage or danger. It was simply a clever repositioning that respected safety and legality while sending a clear message. You don't touch someone else's property without consequence. Over the next hour, she tried the entrance again, hesitating, pulling slightly too far right, then back left. I could see the realization dawn in her eyes. The lines she once assumed were hers weren't hers anymore. The shift was functional but deliberate. She couldn't ignore it, she couldn't bypass it. And for the first time, she was forced to acknowledge that my property, my fence, and the boundaries around it were not negotiable. I documented every reaction. Photos, timestamps, notes. Again, not paranoia, but strategy. If she questioned anything later, I had irrefutable evidence that the work was legal, functional, and deliberate without crossing into harm or confrontation. And honestly, it was fun. Not maliciously fun, but the quiet, clever satisfaction of seeing someone forced to acknowledge their own disrespect without a word being raised. Priceless. By the end of the day, Karen's behavior started to shift. She stopped casually approaching the entrance, slowed down whenever she was near the gate, and even glanced at me from a distance as if wondering whether I'd done something else. The subtle tension, the recognition of boundaries being enforced cleverly and safely, was exactly what I had intended. No confrontation, no escalation, just quiet, undeniable correction. Neighbors noticed too. Some commented, admiring the precision of the work. "Looks professional," one said. Another muttered, "That's a strong boundary." And I nodded politely, coffee in hand, enjoying the recognition. The lesson wasn't just for Karen. It was a subtle statement to the neighborhood that boundaries exist and need to be respected. The final adjustments were minor but satisfying. Posts checked, alignment re-verified, gates functioning smoothly. The entrance was fully operational but unmistakably shifted. Karen's driveway, once taken for granted, now reflected the reality of respect, boundaries, and consequence. She learned without shouting, without threats, without escalation, just a clever, deliberate solution that was permanent and undeniable. By the end of the week, the fence and entrance situation had stabilized. Karen no longer assumed she could cross lines casually. The message was clear, the property respected, and the satisfaction of a carefully executed plan settled deep in my chest. My kids played safely, my garden was secure, and I finally sat on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the sunlight hit the newly aligned fence and entrance, fully appreciating the lesson we had delivered without a single shout. I reflected on the experience and realized something important. The best victories are often quiet. They don't need drama, confrontation, or escalation. They come from careful planning, patience, and creativity, combined with a deep understanding of the rules and boundaries. Karen had learned her lesson. The property lines were clear. The fence was restored. The entrance shifted. And the message had landed without a fight, without damage, and with complete clarity. By the weekend, the entrance was fully shifted, fence restored, and the markers set in place. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the results. Concrete posts straight, pathways subtly realigned, gate positioned perfectly. It wasn't just functional, it was a statement. Every inch of that driveway, every line of that fence, communicated something clear. Boundaries are real, and they must be respected. Karen finally realized that her casual, careless decision to move my fence wasn't just inconvenient. It had consequences. The first time she tried to use her entrance after the adjustments, I watched quietly from a distance. Her confidence faltered immediately. The gate angle was off just enough that she had to pause, check the alignment, and adjust carefully. Her usual smug grin disappeared, replaced by a frown and muttering under her breath. I leaned back on the railing, pretending to prune the bushes, while inside I felt a quiet thrill. This was the culmination of all the preparation, patience, and clever planning, an undeniable lesson delivered without confrontation. Over the next few days, her behavior shifted completely. She no longer assumed she could cross boundaries freely. She approached the gate cautiously, measured her steps, and even nodded politely when she passed by my yard. That subtle change was exactly what I wanted. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't destroyed anything. Yet the lesson was clear, permanent, and completely understood. My kids noticed too. "Dad, she looks confused," my youngest whispered one afternoon. I smiled. "She's learning," I said, and I meant it. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about teaching a lesson through observation, subtle adjustment, and the quiet power of patience and preparation. Sometimes, actions speak louder than words, and in this case, the realignment of an entire entrance did the talking. Neighbors began noticing as well. Mrs. Patel waved from across the street. "Looks like someone finally learned about boundaries," she whispered. I nodded, appreciating the silent acknowledgement. The fence and entrance weren't just about my property. They had become a small but clear demonstration of respect, strategy, and fairness. The lesson was absorbed, quietly but undeniably. By the end of the week, Karen's frustration had mostly faded into careful acceptance. She still glanced at the gate occasionally, but she no longer tried to push or bypass it. The driveway was hers to use, yes, but on my terms, respecting my property. That subtle, strategic victory was far more satisfying than any argument or shouted confrontation ever could have been. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized a few important takeaways. Patience is powerful. Rushing into confrontation rarely achieves lasting results. Preparation and knowledge amplify impact. Understanding property lines, materials, and safe adjustments allowed me to execute a solution that was clever, legal, and effective. Subtlety can teach lessons better than anger. By delivering a consequence through a functional, thoughtful change, I ensured the lesson would stick without creating unnecessary drama. Now, here's the part one really want viewers to think about. What would you do if a neighbor crossed your property line or moved your fence? Would you react impulsively, escalate to authorities, or find a subtle, strategic way to assert boundaries? Drop your stories in the comments. I want to see how you handle situations where respect and property rights are ignored. Was my approach fair, clever, or over the top? Could you have handled it differently? Standing on my porch, sipping coffee, I realized that the real victory wasn't the fence or the driveway. It was the process. Planning, preparation, observation, and subtle execution created a lesson that was permanent, clear, and undeniable. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was intelligent, strategic, and effective, a quiet triumph that ensured respect for boundaries would last for years to come. The fence, the entrance, the markers, all of it now communicated the same thing. My property, my rules, and clear consequences for anyone who thought they could ignore them. Karen had learned, and so had the neighborhood. Boundaries mattered, and clever, patient planning could enforce them without confrontation or hostility. So here's the challenge for you. Viewers, think about your own boundaries, your own property, and how you would respond if someone crossed the line. Could you stay calm, plan carefully, and deliver a permanent, effective lesson? Or would you react impulsively and risk escalation? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Let's talk about clever, strategic, and fair ways to handle conflicts with neighbors. Because in the end, the quiet, permanent, undeniable victories, the ones executed with patience, strategy, and respect, are far more satisfying than any argument, yelling match, or impulsive reaction. And as I stood on the porch, watching sunlight hit the newly aligned fence and shifted entrance, I knew this lesson would last for a long time, both for my family and for anyone who thought they could cross lines without consequences.